This is the Church of St. Paul in the Desert.
In the name of God, Amen. We have some pretty tough words yet again, hard words, that Jesus speaks to the congregation, to those who follow him. And they're words that we kind of get a little squirmish with, if you will. But then again, the word hate conjures up things that we kind of have this basic conflict and within us that Jesus is saying this word. Well, in fact, the Greek word does mean hate, but we have to also remember that Jesus spoke Aramaic. And the Semitic word actually means something more like detachment. And it seems to me that that's where we need to think a little more clearly. But we also need to look and hear those words as ones that we know well. And whether one goes back and looks at Bonhoeffer's Cost of Discipleship, someone who did discover fully the cost of what it meant to follow Jesus Christ. So we also need to look and see what the cost is to follow this Jesus. Now, somewhere in the midst of that, we also need to remember that there is a cost, an accountability, and we all make choices. The author of Deuteronomy speaks about choices. We can make all sorts of choices, and we in our own lives have choices to make. I remember the catchphrase years ago when I was doing some of that turmoil that one does within a family, and someone gave me that rather trite but also very accurate comment. You know, it's really nice that you can choose your friends because you're stuck with your family. There is some of that in the midst of this. But what choices do we make here? What choices do we make in following Jesus? The gospel this morning is harsh. It talks about leaving all of that, giving up all one's possessions. But then somewhere along the line, we need to remember and remind ourselves in terms of the choices we make. Are those possessions a burden, or are they a gift? Are they a blessing? Are they a possibility? Choices. Always making choices. Martin Luther made the comment, a religion that gives nothing, costs nothing, and suffers nothing is worth nothing. The cost of discipleship, the giving up of everything that we own and we possess in order to follow this Jesus. It has much more to do with some internal things that we do in terms of the choices, in terms of the priorities we have, which is also an essential part of this gospel reading. What are our priorities? Where do we put value? What is important to us? And then at some point along the way we say, well, am I willing to count the cost there? We live in a consumer society that says the accumulation of things is what gives us value and a sense of worth. And yet, the church seems to be somewhat countercultural. Surprise, surprise. But that is a part of what this gospel is trying to remind us, that the church and the gospel of Jesus Christ is countercultural. It is in opposition to what most of society says. And we need to remember that that cost has in fact been bought and paid for us. And the promise far outweighs the cost, ultimately. There's a story about that I've heard in two versions about Will Willimon, who was the chaplain at Duke University for many years, is now a bishop, I believe, maybe a superintendent in the Methodist Church. And one day he received a phone call from an irate parent who just lambasted and threw everything at him over the phone. And I am holding you totally responsible for what's happened. I sent my daughter to Duke to get a good education so she could follow in the family tradition. We're all doctors. We want another generation of nephrologists, and that's why she went to Duke, to get a good education. And now she wants to throw it all away and go and spend 3 years in Haiti? I hold you totally responsible. And taken aback, he finally says, now, did you take her to the church to be baptized? Well, yes. Did you take her also to Sunday school regularly? Well, yes. But we just wanted her to be a good person. None of this craziness about going off and giving everything away. Now we make choices, don't we? Do we see our baptism as essential to how we live our lives in the world? Do we see it as being the absolute in terms of how we make the choices we make in life? The priorities we have in life are usually indicated by where we put our money. Money, it tends to be the determiner more often than not about what our priorities are. And I can remember years ago in small St. Agnes when we would pray for people around the world, and I can remember several parishioners leaving the church and saying, why do we have to pray for those other people? And I said, well, first of all, they're praying for us, number one. Number two, that's part of what it means to be a community of faith. Part of what we are about is that shared responsibility. The priorities that we have, the choices we make, the giving of everything, our very being to follow this Jesus. The cost is high, and it can separate us from family and friends and the things the world holds at high value. But to quote yet again from one of my favorite collects in the Book of Common Prayer, in whose service is perfect freedom, is truly the key and the catchphrase. What do we gain? We gain everything. We gain our very being and our life eternal. Amen.